Irvington native Donna Rubin is a consultant focused on women's public speech and voice. She's a speechwriter who's written for many influential women, including Westchester native Martha Stewart. Donna leads workshops for women in corporations teaching the skills of public speaking, self-advocacy, and storytelling. Also, Donna has created a remarkable resource, The Speaking While Female Speech Bank is an online archive with nearly 2,000 speeches by women from across time and around the world. I'll let her tell you about in her talk today and about some fascinating Westchester women who've spoken out. Please welcome Donna Rubin.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Lori. Thank you to the Mamaroneck Library and the Larchmont Library and everybody who's joining us today. Because we can't be together in person, we're here virtually, but it is nice to be connected. Our topic today is women's speech and voice, women's public speech and voice. I've been a speechwriter for a long time and a speech coach, and I lead a workshop, as Paul mentioned, in public speaking oriented to women. It's called the Speak Out Boot Camp. So I pay attention a lot to what women say and to how they say it and to what other people say about women and what they say and how they say it. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts about that, some things that I've learned in recent years since I've been digging into this subject. And I'm also going to talk about Westchester women who've used their voices to speak out, women that are right in our backyard that you probably never thought about as being a speaker. Some of them you will have heard of, some of them you won't know about, but I'm eager to share them with you and to inspire you about using your own voice and speaking up. So I call my talk, this talk, Westchester Women Speak Out, but I also call it The Secret History of Women's Speech, because it is a secret in a sense. And I'll explain more about that as we go along. But many people really don't realize that women have been using their voices. So it's a secret, but one that I hope won't be a secret much longer. When you think of a powerful speaker, I would ask you to think about this. Who generally comes to mind? Well, if you're like most people, you think about a man. Of course, here we have Lincoln and Churchill, JFK, MLK, and Ronald Reagan. They're among what I think of as the pantheon of great speakers, people who are quoted in speeches, other people's speeches, quoted and described as being great orators. But I wonder, why is there not a woman in that category? So I want to go back to the beginnings of oratory. This is Cicero. He's a Roman statesman and a philosopher, a legislator, and also a great rhetorician, a great speaker. And look at how he's standing, how he's positioned in this statue. Has this very masterly look on his face. He's got his arm outstretched. You can't see my arm, but my arm is outstretched. He's got the flowing robes, and in his hand is a scroll. It's either a piece of legislature, maybe it's a speech. It did occur to me it might be some kind of Roman toilet paper. It's probably because I have toilet paper on the mind. Because of the situation we're in. But anyway, he's very manly, right? And I wonder, who is the female equivalent of him, of Cicero? This is a document, a manuscript from 1540, in which Cicero was being touted, oratore. Oratory is an orator. So through the ages, Cicero has been our ideal. Cicero is always called the best speaker and speechwriter. In fact, every year I judge a contest. I'm part of a panel of judges who judge a speechwriters contest. It's called the Cicero Speechwriting Contest. So Cicero is the greatest. Where is our female Cicero? I wanted to know, so I started doing some research. Started out as a little research. I bought a few anthologies, speech speech collections. Actually, I started with the ones on my own bookshelf, just flipping through them. And then I bought a few, and I bought a few more, only in English. You can see here titles like Great Speeches in History, Great Australian Speeches, In Our Own Words, Speeches That Changed History, Speeches That Shaped the Modern World. And I started flipping through them, and then I started counting. How many speeches by men, how many speeches by women? And what I found, or rather what I didn't find, was very many speeches by women. Overwhelmingly, these books have speeches by men. Many of them have only speeches by men. There's some of them that have like 200 speeches, world's greatest, British oratory, greatest American oratory, no speeches by women. And if there are speeches by women, it's always the same handful of women over and over. It's Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, to her troops at Tilbury. She's always in there. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, the suffragists. There's maybe a Helen Keller, maybe a Jane Addams, maybe a Eleanor Roosevelt or a Shirley Chisholm, but it's always the same handful. And where is the imagination? Where's the research that these people who pull these collections together, these are the gatekeepers of the way we think about history. And it's not just the speech anthologies, it's also our history books, our sociology books, our rhetoric books, our debate books. They all use male examples. Here's one of my favorites, the White House Handbook of Oratory, is published in 1899. It's a beautiful little book. But inside, it's speeches, collections of speeches, and not just speeches, but illustrations of how a speaker should stand to project himself. They're a little almost comical, but this one is defiance. You can't see me, but I'm being defiant in my own position. This one is ridicule, malediction. I mean, but what is the point that I mean to make here, which is that men throughout history have received instruction on how to speak, yes, how to speak well, but also how to hold themselves, how to comport themselves, how to present themselves so that they look like figures of authority, and so that we respect them and give them that authority and prominence. And you know, it's like I think of it as sort of like a master narrative. Historians talk about master narrative. Well, this is one that's so deep and so unconscious that we don't even think about it consciously, probably, but when we associate a great speaker, it's a man. Here's another one. Great American Speeches. Our country's life and history in the words of its great men. Not great women, great men. So I did a little bit of research, started to do some research into the history of women's speech. And look what I found. In the upper left-hand corner here, you'll see the branks. This poor woman is getting branked, or the branks. You'll see she has like a helmet on her head. It's like a chastity belt that was placed around the head of a woman who basically was saying things that were unpopular. Sometimes it was called a scold's bridle or a witch's bridle. We all know that witches were persecuted. There were women who were persecuted for saying the wrong thing, for being accused of having supernatural powers, evil powers. So this poor woman is getting branked. She's pushed up against a wooden post, and there's a chain, so she's chained to that post. And it's a means of torture and humiliation. A woman who said the wrong thing would get a contraption put over her head. She was either paraded around in public or stuck onto a wooden post and humiliated. Yeah, these are branking torture instruments. You see the one on the left has a little bit. That's a bit that would dig into the woman's tongue. So she literally couldn't speak. These are awful. These are actual devices. These are illustrations in a pamphlet that I purchased, but the devices are in museums in the north of England. I should say that branking was used in Scotland and in northern England, starting in the 17th century and then on into the 18th century, and even more recent. And it was brought into the New World in New England and some other places, and sometimes used against men too. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't just exclusively for women, but when they call it a scold's guard, you know the scold was almost certainly a woman. Men aren't scolds. There's another one. So I'm also a big postcard collector. I've been collecting since I was a child, and I have some of these postcards that are deeply misogynistic. And it looks like this one came right out of branking school. You've got a wife that nags, get one of these patent gags. These were postcards that were published around the turn of the century, around 1900 or so, right about the time when women were about to get the vote. Women were making a lot of noise. They were very militant. And these postcards were published that really made fun of torturing women. It made light of humiliating and torturing women. They're awful. I'm just going to show you a few of them. There's a bunch of them that you can Google them, or actually I've written about them in articles. Wish I could tell you. No. This woman has a snake coming out of her mouth. Many of these are located in the amazing collection of the Glasgow Women's Library in Scotland. Peace at last. Look at this poor woman's tongue. The phrase peace at last was associated, of course, with the Armistice Agreement and the end of World War I, the agreement between the Germans and the Allies. But it has a double meaning, right? Peace at last. Peace at last, meaning a woman's going to shut up. We'll have peace when the woman shuts up. Poor woman, she's crying. And here's one of my favorites. I'd rather kiss her than hear her talk. Votes for women. Of course, this is infantilizing, right? It's disgusting. Last one, more recent. This is from the Calvin Company. They were based in Kansas City, Missouri. They were a company that made industrials, you know, advertising films, videos for companies. They were called industrials. The trouble with women, they have mouths. Women have mouths. Well, I found all this really, really repugnant. So what I decided to do was create a website for women's speeches, a collection of women's speeches, and it's called the Speaking Well Female Speech Bank. And I loaded some speeches on, I loaded some more speeches on, and eventually I have almost 2,000 speeches, as Paul said, of women from all walks of life, women across history and from across history and around the world, representing every point of view. It's by no means my intention to represent women's points of views that I agree with. My intention is to represent points of view from across the spectrum, every possible spectrum. Okay, now we're going to talk about some Westchester women who use their voices to speak out. And the first one is the incredible DEBORAH Sampson GANNETT. She's really a woman who was quite obscure. In recent years, she's gotten a little more well-known because, of course, women's history is being reinvestigated and people are writing about them, but she was virtually an unknown in history, and she really was quite a remarkable woman. She was born in Massachusetts. I'm looking up the year. 1760. She was born in Massachusetts. Quite an impoverished family, a poor family. And she was actually an indentured servant to another family for a while because her mother didn't have enough money to take care of him. The father had disappeared or gone away. And she was very restless, and she had quite an unusual spirit. And when she was 18, she bound up her chest to look like a man, and she went on the road for a year, and she just traveled around and worked and had odd jobs. And this was really quite unusual for her day. And because women didn't travel alone, right? And travel was very difficult in those times. You had to go on wagons along rutted roads. There were no throughways or highways. Anyway, so she had an adventurous spirit. And when she came back from that trip, the Revolutionary War was ongoing, and the American Army was calling for recruits So she had just traveled and pretended she was a man, and she decided that's what she was going to do again. I love this picture of her. So what does she do? She goes down to the local recruitment office and she signs up and dresses as a man and signs up, and of course she's discovered right away and kicked out. But then she persists. She goes back again to another recruitment office. It's the 4th Massachusetts Regiment, and she signs up, and this time she succeeds. And this is the name she uses. This is her alias, Robert Shirtliff. So she joins the Army, and she does everything that a new recruit would do in the Army, in the Continental Army. She goes on drills, she probably digs some ditches, she learns to fire her musket, and she's involved in some skirmishes in the war. We don't have really good hard data on what she did during the war. In fact, all the details of her life are pretty murky, and there's a lot of contradictory information. But one of the reasons, the heartbreaking reasons that we don't know, is because she kept a diary of her war experiences. And then one time she was crossing a river and it was in a trunk, and the boat sank and the trunk was lost in the water. So we lost her war diary, which is really a great loss, because it would be fascinating to know all these details, and she never wrote them down anywhere else. But in any case, we know that she was involved in some skirmishes, including right here in Westchester County. Now, Westchester County was right in the middle between the Continental and the British Army, so there were skirmishes all over. It is said that she was involved in the Battle of Tarrytown. I don't believe there was a Battle of Tarrytown. I think there were battles of Tarrytown, but somewhere between Tarrytown and Eastchester, she was involved in some skirmishes. At one time, she took some British soldiers prisoner. In any case, she saw combat. Amazingly, she was in combat and she was wounded in battle. She was wounded in battle. She got a laceration on her head, and she got 2 musket shots to her leg and had these pistol balls embedded in her leg. And one of them, she pulls out herself. She manages to extricate it, and the other stayed in her leg the rest of her life, because she did not want to get medical care, because she figured as soon as she went to a doctor, she would be found out as a woman and kicked out of the Army. Well, of course, that is what happened. She did get involved in another skirmish and ended up in a hospital near Philadelphia. And the doctor right away figured out she was a woman, and she got a discharge. He didn't turn her in. She was honorably discharged, but that was the end of her combat experience and wartime experience. But for me, the story is just beginning. She goes home to Sharon, Massachusetts. She gets married, and she has 3 kids, and she becomes a farm wife. But she also meets this man named Horace Mann. He was a publisher, and he was quite a wily person. He knew a lot about PR, obviously, and he persuaded her, he packaged her, he persuaded her to write her memoirs. And I think he helped her write them. Maybe they were ghostwritten, but she did publish her memoirs, The Female Review or Memoirs of an American Young Lady. Citizen of Massachusetts. He was in Dedham, Massachusetts. So this is her memoir she published. I don't believe she made a lot of money on it, but in any case, then he persuaded her to do something even more amazing, which is go on the road and speak. So she did. In 1802, she goes to Massachusetts, to Boston, and this is the broadside promoting her speech. An address delivered with applause at the Federal State Theater in Boston 4 successive nights of the different plays beginning March 22nd, 1802. That's the theater, the Boston Theater. It had just been built, then it burned down, then it was built again, and she was there not that long afterwards. And she was there 4 nights in 1802 in March. This is a playbill or an advertisement. Theater, it's hard to read, I know. Theater of the Federal Street. And at the very bottom, if you can make it out, Mrs. GANNETT, equipped in complete uniform, We'll go through the manual exercise. So here's what she would do. There would be an audience, right? And there would be a play, like a little play. Maybe there would be a little adapted Shakespeare play or another drama. Then I think the curtain would come down, and then she would come out alone on stage. And she would be dressed in her full Continental uniform, the blue and white uniform with all the buttons and her hat. And she would talk about her experiences, and she had a speech. And I'm pretty sure Horace Mann wrote the speech for her. Unfortunately, she doesn't tell war stories. It would be so interesting if she told about the battle, but she does talk in a very thoughtful way about her role. And I'm going to share with you some of her speech. But then here, I'll share it with you now. Here's a quote from her speech, and I'm going to read a little bit of it, and I want you to read along with me, and you'll see how flowery the language is, and also how she's making really a powerful point. She says, she's talking about her actions in the war, and she says, "They are a breach in the decorum of my sex, unquestionably, and perhaps too unfortunately ever irreconcilable with the rigid maxims of the moralist, and a sacrifice which, while it may seem perfectly incompatible with the requirements, and which of course must ring discord in the ear and disgust to the bosom of sensibility and refinement, I must be content to leave to time the most scrutinizing inquiry to disclose." So that's a very long way of saying, you guys may not like it, but we're going to let time tell. She's actually, if you can read between the lines, her tone is quite cheeky there. I love it. But you do have to read, you have to read it pretty carefully, because the whole speech goes on like this. It's about a 15-minute speech, and the language is quite dense. It's on my website. And then I should say the last thing she does is she goes through this maneuvers with her musket, 27 gun maneuvers in different positions on stage, and the audience goes wild. They just love it. She continues on takes her show on the road. She goes to, I think, 20 different cities. She goes to Providence and Northampton and Schenectady and down to New York City. And she is paid for her speeches, making her the first paid American woman speaker, which is fantastic. There were other women who spoke. I have some other examples on my website of American women who spoke in various forums and venues, but she's the first one who was a professional speaker. This is a statue of her at the Sharon Public Library in Sharon, Massachusetts, where she is a local hero. And here's a monument to her. Deborah Sampson GANNETT. And of course, I love her because, well, for a variety of reasons, but because she was a speaker, and you will not find her speeches in any of those books that I showed you, none of them. It's not as though it was completely unknown that she gave this speech. It's just that no one bothered to find them or think that it was important enough to include. Okay, our next speaker. CARRIE CHAPMAN CATT. CARRIE CHAPMAN CATT was one of the leading organizers of the suffrage movement. Now, I always wonder when they use that word organizer, like what does it mean? What's an organizer? Well, an organizer, right, she organizes meetings, she plans, she approves the programs and the literature, but she was so much more than that. She was a master psychologist, because there were so many competing rivalries and different visions of how the suffrage strategy should play out. And she was known for and had a brilliance for having a moderate position and being able to bring different sides together. For example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was really at heart a radical. She had a very radical vision, as opposed to Susan B. Anthony. And it was very hard. And then there was a big split in the suffrage movement. There were two complete different camps, and who disliked one another and were not working together for the cause. And CARRIE CHAPMAN CATT, as an organizer and an inspiring leader, was managed to bring them together. But the other thing that she did that was really remarkable is she used her voice. She used her public speaking skills. Here she is as a young woman. And she was from Indiana. I think she was born in Kansas, but she was raised in, Iowa. She was raised in Iowa, and she went to Iowa State Agriculture College. Now it's Iowa State today. But when she was there, she joined a group for leadership. It was a leadership, students organization, but they had this crazy rule that women couldn't speak. And she thought that was wrong. And she protested against it and spoke out in a meeting, which prompted a discussion about whether women should be allowed to speak, which ended up in granting women the right to speak in this organization. So at a very early age, we can see the signs of what she is going to become and what she would excel at. Photo made 1908. That's a little bit after. It was 1900, she became president of NASA, NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She took over from Susan B. Anthony, who was quite old at that time. I think Susan B. Anthony died in 1906. So she was getting too old to head the organization. CARRIE CHAPMAN CATT took over. Beautiful picture. There she is again. I love this one. She's got her little glasses on her shoulder. To me, it looks exactly like a Thomas Eakins painting. So beautiful. A portrait. She became quite a famous woman. Here she is on the cover of Time magazine. The feathers in her hat. Those are ostrich feathers. And here she is in the New York Times, Mrs. Catt, crusading around the world for suffrage. Well, when it says crusading, it means speaking, right? That's what she was doing, public speaking. Here is her house. She moved to Westchester. I really should say she had one husband for a year. He was a newspaper editor. That was Mr. Catt. He died. Then she had a second husband. He was a very wealthy engineer. And when he passed away, she inherited his money and became very wealthy and moved to Westchester. Let me see the year. Oh, I know what year it was. It was 1919, because she moved into this house just before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the vote, exactly 100 years ago. She moved in, I think, in 1919, and of course it was passed in the House, it was passed in the Senate, and then it had to go to the states for ratification. That was in August 1920. This picture I took yesterday morning. I'd never seen this house, and I drove up to see it. It's about 20 minutes from where I live in Irvington. It's in Briarcliff Manor. It's on Ryder Road. It's above the Sawmill Parkway, but the entrance to the house is on Ryder Road. When I drove up in the age of COVID, of course, I had my mask on, and the owner was in the front yard, very cordially welcomed me into the yard and invited me to take pictures. But this is the house where CARRIE CHAPMAN CATT lived with her third partner, who was a woman, Mary Garrett Hay. She was also an active suffragist. Molly, they called her. So Molly and CARRIE CHAPMAN CATT lived in this house, and CARRIE CHAPMAN CATT loved the house. It's built on a kind of slope. There was a lot more acreage connected to it at that time. She had some cows, and it's called Juniper Ledge. I think I have a picture of it. Yes, Juniper Ledge, because they were full of juniper trees. And CARRIE CHAPMAN CATT was also a temperance advocate, right, against drinking alcohol. And she would make a joke that she bought the place because she didn't want the juniper trees to be used to make gin. But it's a beautiful piece of property, and she adored it. They were very happy there. There's a little creek running through it, part of the Pecanico stream that runs into the Hudson. So after, I think she was in that house for about, let me see what year she moved. She moved to another part of Westchester, to a cottage. That's what she called it, a cottage, because the steps up and the stairs became a little bit too much for Molly, and she moved into this cottage in New Rochelle. That's not anybody's definition of a cottage. Payne Avenue, 120 Payne Avenue, New Rochelle. Here she is. I love this photo with her suffragist contemporaries. Carrie Chapman CATT is the third from the, or second from the right on the bottom, on the first row, the bottom row in the dark dress. But I love these women's hats. On the right is Helen Hamilton Gardner, another great woman speaker. Here she is in her older years. And here she is, another picture in her older years, and here she is when she died of a heart attack. She and Hay are buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. But here's what I have next. I found this online. It's a clip of her speaking, and I'm going to play it for you. Let me make sure. I'm going to play the beginning, and you send me your thumbs up if you can hear it, okay?
The organized woman movement dates from 1848, when a convention to consider the rights of women was held in Seneca Falls, New York. The committee drafting the list of women's wrongs found her grievances against the government of men to be the same number that American men had had against King George. It took George Washington 6 years to rectify men's grievances by war, but it took 72 years to establish women's rights by law. At least 1,000 legal enactments were necessary, and every one was a struggle against ignorant opposition. Women's suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache, crowned by victory.
Hard work and heartache crowned by victory. Okay, moving along. Isadora Duncan. You couldn't be have more of a contrast from Carrie Chapman CATT to Isadora Duncan, but she's another outstanding woman in history, and someone, of course, I'm sure you've all heard of, the famous dancer, modern dancer. Beautiful, beautiful woman. She was born and raised in San Francisco, and her family was quite artistic, and she was dancing by the age of 6 and giving dance lessons to her neighbors on the block, as was her sister Elizabeth and her brother Raymond. There were 4 kids, and they were all artistic and into dance. So Isadora Duncan quite early identified herself as someone who was committed to art and beauty. She recognized she was an artist, and of course, what does any young woman do but make her way to New York, right, at that time? And then to Europe. In New York, actually, she joined a troupe, a dance troupe, but she couldn't stand the form of dancing. It was ballet, and they were on point, and they had rigid costumes and all the positions, and she hated it. She just hated it. So she goes to Europe, where she goes to the British Museum, and here's what she sees. These bas-reliefs of Greek dancers. And she absolutely falls in love with everything Hellenistic, everything Greek. She and her brother Raymond does too. Raymond actually moves to Athens, lives on a villa outside of Athens with his Greek wife. They dress in tunics and homemade sandals, and don't allow anybody into the house who's not dressed similarly. Nobody in modern dress gets to enter the house. So Isadora sees all these works of art in the Louvre and in the British Museum. These are Greek statues. I mean, you can see exactly where the movement comes from. I think she truly believed that she was taking dance back to its roots, right? To the cradle of Western civilization, ancient Greece. But from my reading, I don't think that we actually have any choreographies of ancient Greece. I don't think we know how they danced in ancient Greece. So it was her invention, it was her interpretation of the kind of free movement and expression of nature that she imagined that they would have embodied. And what was so unusual about Isadora Duncan was that not only did she never choreographed, right? She believed in everything free form and natural, but she also had a philosophy. She believed in, she had certain tenets of her belief. She believed in evolutionary movement. One gesture follows another naturally. And she was against this Cartesian dichotomy between the brain and the body. And she believed the solar plexus was the source of all human power. So she had these beliefs that, I don't want to sound like I think they were kooky. I think she was a bit kooky, but she was an artist. A lot of kooky, eccentric artists change the world in profound ways. But she was eccentric. She would go around in this tunic on the streets of Berlin or the streets of Paris or London, and people were shocked. And women were wearing corsets. This was the end of the 19th century. Women were wearing long, street length dresses, and she would walk around like this, and it was scandalous. I mean, it was really scandalous. So she's committed to teaching dance, and she has a dance studio in Germany, in Berlin, in a suburb of Berlin, Grunewald. Then she goes to Paris. This is the World War I is about to break out. So she's like one step ahead of the soldiers. She goes to Paris, then World War I breaks out. She comes to New York and establishes her studio in Manhattan. And a beautiful picture, huh? And her sister Elizabeth comes, and they bring these 6 little girls that Isadora has adopted, the Isadorables, the Isadorables. 6 little girls that they brought over from Europe to be in their dance school. And so she founds the dance school in Manhattan. Then they bring it up to Westchester. She came to Yonkers. They were in Tarrytown, and they were up on Mount Airy Road in Croton. I'm sure some of you must know Croton. Croton on Hudson had become, around the turn of the century, a center for intellectuals and artists and bohemians and political radicals. John Reed was up there and wrote 7 Days That Shook the World. And it was Mabel Dodge Lewin who went there. She was a society columnist, and she moved to Croton, and she was wealthy, and she sponsored a lot of these artists to live up there, and they had a circle up there. And that's where Elizabeth founded the Elizabeth Duncan School of Dance. And Elizabeth taught the students, and Isadora would drop in now and then when she wasn't traveling around the world, making money dancing, but also pursuing love affairs and having adventures. Isadora danced her way across Westchester. I mean, I found references to her dancing at the Vanderlip estate, down in Scarborough on a tabletop at a all-night party for the Argentinian ambassador. She danced at Undermeyer Gardens. Of course, it was in the Undermeyer estate She danced all over, anywhere there were wealthy patrons, and you know there were a lot of wealthy people in Westchester, and she had friends all over Westchester. Her agent lived in White Plains. He was very famous, and her friend Anna Nazimova, the actress, lived over in Rye. So, you know, Westchester was her base, but she was always traveling. Those are the Isadorable, her students, the students of Isadora Duncan. That is the old cement barn up on Mount Airy, and I've been there quite a few times. You can go by there. It's still standing. It's a local landmark, and that's where Elizabeth would hold recitals, and supposedly she would hold recitals at night with gas lamps, dance recitals with the girls. It's beautiful up there. This is Isadora with her two children, Deirdre and Patrick. She had two beautiful children. She was not married when she had them, which was of course scandalous. And both of them came from quite famous families. I think her son was her son was the child of Ellen Terry's son. Ellen Terry, the famous Shakespearean actress, her son, that was the father of her son. And then her daughter was the child of the Peter Singer, who was from the Singer's sewing machine fortune. And he bought Isadora an estate in Paris where she could start a dance school at one time. So she had various patrons who were her lovers and her admirers. This is her with her children. And then a terrible thing happened. Her children were visiting her. Let's see the date. I think I have the date here. Her children were visiting her in Neuilly-sur-Seine, right, a suburb of Paris, and they were dressed in their white winter coats, and she said goodbye to them, and they got in the car with their nanny, their Scottish nanny, and the chauffeur cranked up the car. They drove away, and then the car stalled, and he cranked up the car, but he got out right to the front of the car, and he forgot that the car was in first gear. And when he cranked it up, the engine started and the car bolted, and he had to jump out of the way, and the car went ahead. It went down a bank and right into the Seine River, and both of the children drowned, as did her nanny, the nanny. Terrible accident. I mean, really terrible accident. And Isadora was sick. I think for a year she was not functional. She was traveling around Europe with friends who were taking care of her. And then she really did get back. I don't know that she ever recovered, of course, but she got back in the dance world when she was invited to Russia to start a school there. She was in love with the Bolsheviks and the romance of the Russians. So she went off to Moscow and started a school. And that was the beginning of another chapter in her life, because in Russia, she met a poet who was 18 years her junior. Sergei Yesenin was his name, and they fell in love. I don't exactly know how well they communicated, because her Russian was not so good and his English was not so good, but they did have a love affair, and she married him. Contrary to everything she'd always sworn she would never do, she actually married him. She was against marriage. She thought it was a terrible proposition, but she married him so that he could get a visa to come to the United States, which he did, and then they didn't get along. So they separated. He went back to Russia, and in 1925, he killed himself. He hung himself. So that was another terrible tragedy for Isadora. So why am I talking about Isadora Duncan? Yes, she was a Westchester person. We know that. But this is the car that she was in when she died. I'm talking about her because Isadora Duncan was a speaker. She was a public speaker. Isadora Speaks. I don't know if you can see the cover of this book. It's a book I have in my collection. I have about 5 or 6 speeches by her in my collection. She got up and talked about her philosophy of dance. She spoke to her audiences about what she was doing, And her speeches are beautiful. They're quite poetic, of course, as you would expect. And I admire her for that, and I value that about her. And I have an excerpt from one of her speeches that I want to share with you. She gave this speech in Berlin, at the press club in Berlin, and she talks about, it's called The Dancer of the Future. The dancer of the future will be one whose body and soul have so harmoniously come together that the natural language of the soul will have the movement of the body. The dancer will not belong to a nation, but to all humanity. She will dance not in the form of nymph, nor fairy, nor coquette, but in the form of woman in its greatest and purest expression. She will realize the mission of a woman's body and the holiness of all its parts. This speech, turns out, I don't know that, I can't say it was famous, but in the dance world, it is well known because it's considered a manifesto of modern dance. So thank you, Isadora, for that contribution to the speech world. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, Isadora died tragically. I showed you the car. She was at a party in the south of France, in Nice, visiting her friend, her best friend, Mary Desty, and she was having a romance or a flirtation with this Italian-French driver named Benoit Falchetto. And she had a scarf, a big red scarf that she wore. Mary Desty had given her this scarf as a gift. It was bright red, which she loved. She loved red. It was the color of revolution and love. And she left the party and she said, "Au revoir, mes amis, goodbye, my friends. Je vais à l'amour, I'm going for love." But some other people said that what she really said was, "Je vais à la gloire, I go for the glory." I don't know, whatever she said, she dashed out the door, joined her lover, Benoit Falchetto, in that car. He takes off on the, and this is Nice, on the famous Promenade des Anglais. They didn't go very far before her scarf got caught in the spokes of the wheel and yanked her out of the car and smashed her up against the wheel and broke her spine in 2 places, and she was dead. Mary Desty runs down into the road, tries to pull her away from the wheel. I mean, it was just horrible, horrible. And a tragic end. I mean, the end of her life was really kind of sad. Anyway, she was traveling around the world, trying to find money to finance her various plans, but nothing was really coming together. I mean, she had really quite a sad life, and she was a brilliant woman. Okay, Isadora Duncan. Next, Amelia Earhart, the great Amelia Earhart, the aviator. As you know, Amelia Earhart broke records with her historic flying. She never went to college. She applied to Columbia, but she dropped out because she had a love of aviation. When she was 10 years old, she'd gone with her father to an airfield, and he had paid, I think he paid $10, and she went up in the air, and her world was never the same. She fell in love with flight and said, "I'm going to be in the air." So she got her pilot's license. She was the, I think it was, she was the 16th person in the United States to get her pilot's license. And then in 1927, a famous thing happened. Lucky Lindy, Charles Lindbergh, flew across the Atlantic solo. There he is with the Spirit of St. Louis, and he was the sensation. He wrote a book that year, 1927, became a bestseller. He was on a speaking tour, made lots of money. Sure enough, next thing you know, Isadora Duncan gets a phone call from someone who says, "How would you like to fly across the Atlantic?" Which she did. She became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, but she was not at the helm. This was in 1928. She was not at the controls. She was in the back, keeping the log. She later called herself a sack of potatoes. But she was chosen not because she was the best aviator. She was a great aviator, but she was chosen. She was a pioneer and a very brave woman, but she was chosen because of her wholesome good looks. She was that type of a girl, and she looked like Charles Lindbergh, doesn't she? So sure enough, one of her publicists, her publisher, becomes her husband, George Putnam, of the Putnam Publishing House. They marry and she moves with him to Rye. It's actually on the Rye-Harrison border. There she is in the house. And this is funny. This is from the newspaper. Minister of Sweden, former mayor of Rye, welcomed Mrs. Putnam on behalf of the village of Rye, where she was greeted by the mayor. Responding with a brief speech, Mrs. Putnam remarked, "I grow my vegetables in Rye and I eat them in Harrison." The home of her husband is in Harrison and part of the grounds is in Rye. There she is on the left with her husband on the beach at Rye. It looks like Rye Playland, I'm not sure, but it is Rye. And there she is with George, her husband, in Rye. Now, the other thing he does two things for her. He publishes her books and he puts her on speaking tour, and she speaks everywhere. I don't think Amelia Earhart really loved to speak. She was a bit of a wooden speaker. She generally read her speeches, but she did it, and she did it all the time. She spoke everywhere, and what she said was very powerful.
Probably no scientific development is more startling than the effect of this new and growing economic independence upon women themselves. When the history of our times is written, it must record as supremely significant the physical, psychic, and social changes women have undergone in these exciting decades. And exemplifies the possible relationship of women and the creations of science.
Last excerpt from this speech.
For women who work, while still greatly outnumbered, they are finding more and more opportunities for employment in the ranks of this latest transportation medium. May I hope this movement will spread throughout all branches of applied science and industry, and that women may come to share with men the joy of doing. Those can appreciate rewards most who have helped create.
So what she's doing is she's talking about the new technology of aviation, and she's telling women, get involved. There's opportunity for you. Get involved. There are jobs. It's exciting. It's adventurous. So it's really a feminist speech in many ways. It is.
Aviation.
Here are the books she wrote. The fun of it, that was for young girls. That's a stamp that was issued for her. And this is the monument to Amelia Earhart that is in the park, which is next to the Harrison train station. It's in the shape of a propeller. I think I took this picture. It's right by the train tracks on the, well, I don't know which side it is, the opposite side from the library. And the road where she lived in Harrison Rye, this says Harrison, right, is used to be Locust Lane. Now it's called Amelia Earhart Lane. Okay, this is our last person. We don't have much time. I'm going to be pretty quick. But this is Joan Rivers, our own Joan Rivers. I say that because she comes from Larchmont. She was Joan Malinsky. I love that picture. And here's where she grew up. It's on Oxford Road in Larchmont. And I want to read to you what she says about growing up there. Just give me a second. She said, very affectionately, you knew all your neighbors, they knew you at the drugstore, they knew you at the movie theater. I couldn't wait to get out because all you wanted to do was get to New York and get busy, but it was a fabulous childhood. And what's interesting, especially interesting about that, is later she made Larchmont a touchstone of one of her routines. She would talk about being the last girl from Larchmont. You know, Joan Rivers made a thing about being ugly, right? She wasn't attractive. She would put herself down and talk about how hard it was for her to get ahead with men. And she always talked about Larchmont as a place that launched her, but also in a way, she had a very sarcastic approach toward being the last girl from Larchmont. You know, she practiced a kind of humor. It was sort of a bridge between Borscht Belt and modern humor, but she called it, you could call it insult comedy. She would be very insulting. And obviously she was not everybody's taste, but I have a great admiration for her. Here she is with her husband, who Johnny Carson introduced her to. He's Edgar Rosenberg. He was a British producer, and he was her manager. Here's what she said in that, there's a New Yorker piece, a famous New Yorker piece called Last Girl from Larchmont, Last Girl in Larchmont. And let me read you just an excerpt. I'm not Joan Rivers, but I'll do my best. I'm from a little town called Larchmont, where if you're not married and you're a girl and you're over 21, you're better off dead. It's that simple, you know? And I was the last girl in Larchmont. Do you know how that feels? 21, 22, 24. So Joan Rivers had a lot of setbacks in her career. At one point, Johnny Carson wasn't speaking with her. She went off with she went to Fox. Johnny Carson was furious. Then Fox canceled her and fired her and fired her husband as her manager. She lost all of her routines. I mean, her career really took a nosedive, and her agent told her she would never work again. And I have an excerpt that when she actually considered suicide, she was bulimic and depressed, and she thought about killing herself. And then she had a shift. She did come back. She mustered her momentum again, and she turned herself into a speaker about starting over. She would speak on grief to anybody who would pay her, basically. And she gave a talk in White Plains in 1995 at the Crowne Plaza in White Plains. There's a wonderful article in the New York Times about it. And she called it stand-up therapy. And she basically told the audience that whatever had happened to them, that they needed to get a good therapist and get over their grief and get back on with it. And she always said, laughter is healing. I wonder if you saw that 2010 documentary that was so wonderful, Joan Rivers, A Piece of Work. So I want to play you a little piece that's quite unusual. It's a speech. I mean, it's a wonderful speech, but it's not Joan Rivers as you probably ever saw her. It's from 1990 when she won a Daytime Emmy Award.
And the winner is, I'm shaking, Joan Rivers. Thank you. I always had a fantasy, you know, as a child that I'd win one of these, and I never thought I'd be the soul when the fantasy came true, but here it is. And I didn't think I was going to win. I'm not being cute. So I have no speech prepared. I have to thank everyone at Tribune. They taught me what it's like to work with honorable, decent people. And no, you don't know. I don't mean it that way. Thank you to Shelley and to Peter Marino and to Don Hacker, to my staff who was incredible. And I don't mean this cute. I mean, working at 5 in the morning happily, to our crew that's wonderful, to Dorothy Melvin, my manager, to Steve Ober, who started the show, to Larry, who has just brought it to what it is today, Larry Ferber. And especially, I know the red light's on, so I have to hurry, to my daughter Melissa, because the last 2 years have been very difficult. 2 years ago, I couldn't get a job in this business. I could not get a job. My income dropped to 1/16 of what it was before I was fired. And people said I wouldn't work again. And my husband, as you know, had a breakdown. It's so sad that he's not here, because it was my husband, Edgar Rosenberg, who always said, you can turn things around. And except for one terrible moment in a hotel room in Philadelphia when he forgot that, this is really him, because he was with me from the beginning, and I'm so sorry that he didn't.
That really makes me want to cry. I admire Joan Rivers for a lot of reasons, but for nothing else, that she was so candid about the sorrow that she experienced and really gave encouragement to other people. Okay, so I want to wrap things up really quickly. So we've talked about 5 women. I mean, they couldn't have been more different, right? A soldier, a suffragist, a dancer, an aviator, and a stand-up comic. What do they have in common? Well, they have a few things. One is they all faced incredible obstacles to speak because they were a woman. And let me just tell you a few things. Sojourner Truth, the great orator Sojourner Truth, she's a Westchester woman. She lived in Ossining for 2 years. She had the hardest time speaking. She was people would call her names. One time she was speaking in public and someone yelled out, "Are you a man?" And she ripped open her blouse to show him. I mean, Sojourner Truth was a great orator, and another wonderful Westchester woman, Lucy Stone, a great abolitionist, anti-slavery and women's rights speaker. One time she was speaking in a church in the wintertime, and someone stuck a nozzle in the window and doused her with cold water. Her daughter wrote in her memoir that Lucy Stone put on a shawl and just kept talking. Inez Milholland, she was a lawyer who led an investigation into abuse of conditions at Sing Sing prison right here in Ossining. And she also had a very hard time. In fact, she collapsed. She gave a suffrage speech and she collapsed in the middle of her speech and died a month later in San Francisco. She became the martyr of the suffragist cause. Margaret Sanger went to nursing school in White Plains. She lived in Yonkers. She lived in Hastings for a number of years. Margaret Sanger was arrested something like 8 times, at least 8 times, on obscenity charges for promoting contraception and for trying to sell contraceptive devices. And she spent a year in exile in England to avoid a trial on pornography charges for sharing a newsletter through the mail about contraception. It was considered pornography. So each one of these women, this is Josephine Baker at the March on Washington in 1963, the only woman who spoke at the March on Washington. All these women broke barriers using their voices. The other thing they have in common is that they are not remembered for their speaking. You won't find their speeches in the history books. I mean, Lucy Stone, maybe you would, but I mean, none of the other Westchester women, their speeches are not included in the hierarchy of speeches, which I think is an outrage. I think it's time to change that for our generation, but also for future generations, for little girls that we want to encourage to speak. Now, the third thing they have in common is that each of them understood that a speech is not just words, right? It's not just your voice and words. It's a call to arms. It's action. And each of these women was speaking out for a cause that she believed in and wanted to advance. And it's important to understand that how important speech is to our democracy, to open discourse, to free exchange of ideas in our society. And so I want to encourage all of you to use your voices, to have these women as your inspiration, and whether you're in Westchester or elsewhere, to use your voices to speak for whatever cause you believe in. So what does a powerful speaker look like? She looks like all of us. So thank you so much. It's been great to be with you, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that you'll take the message to heart, and I hope to hear you speaking in the near future.